Hi, everyone. Today, we are pleased to be able to have a conversation with Leah Rothstein. Her expertise in the full range of housing policy comes from more than 2 decades of experience as a consultant to affordable housing developers and local governments, and as a community and union organizer. She is joining us from her hometown of San Francisco, and she is joining us to talk about a couple of books that she has been involved in, and also one that her father, Richard Rothstein, a historian, recently completed called The Color of Law. Thank you, Leah, for joining us today. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we're going to talk first about The Color of Law. And I hope that you will tell your dad how much I love the book. I have a signed copy of it that I definitely will never lose. But when your dad wrote the book, and he decided to do this, what do you think was his particular outcome that he was looking for?
Yeah, well, as he tells the story, he started looking into this history of how residential segregation was created after he read an opinion written by Chief Justice John Roberts in a school desegregation case in front of the Supreme Court. And in that opinion, Chief Justice Roberts argued that the government played no role in creating segregated schools and communities, and so had no role to play in remedying that segregation. Now, this was a case involving a couple of school districts. One was in St. Louis. And my dad read this opinion, and he recalled reading a story about St. Louis from the mid-20th century when an African-American family wanted to buy a home in a white neighborhood there, and they were prohibited from doing so. And so the family had a white friend who owned a home and decided to buy a home for his Black friend and sell it to him. So he was a straw buyer because the Black family couldn't buy their own home. And when this happened and the Black family moved into their home, a white mob attacked the home and the family. The mob was protected by the local police. It was allowed to go forward and harass this family. And then the white homeowner who helped his Black friend buy a home was later prosecuted, tried, and convicted of sedition. So my dad put these pieces together and said, this is just nonsense that the government had nothing to do with creating segregation. This is a clear story, a clear history in this very city where the Supreme Court case is taking on desegregated schools. And it's clear that the government at all levels in this city had a role in playing, in creating and maintaining the segregation there. So he started looking into it more. And, I think his main outcome and goal for writing the book was to expose that history that we'd all forgotten about how explicitly and intentionally the government created racially segregated neighborhoods.
I have to say that I thought that I had heard many of the stories and a lot of the history that was discussed in your dad's book. And I truly appreciate how that awareness helped catalyze his intent to bring a better exposure to the history of how these communities have been resolved the way they have, to become separated and segregated communities, and the multiple layers of impact that has. But what's really fascinating to me is that while I thought I knew these things, I really found that my understanding was incredibly shallow. And I wonder if, you think about why it has been so hard for us to understand how we got here and what the impacts of these decisions have left us on a contemporary basis in our cities and in our communities. Why do you think that has been the case?
Yeah, well, the subtitle of The Color of Law is a forgotten history of how the government created segregation. And it really is a forgotten history. At the time, it wasn't hidden, the acts of the government in creating racially segregated communities. They weren't trying to hide it. It was very explicit and intentional. But over time, we've forgotten how intentional and how explicit that was. And we've come to accept this myth of the de facto segregation idea, that segregation happened by accident or because of personal choice or any number of reasons that we sort of have no control over. So we have no agency to do anything about. And I think we've come to believe that because the inequality, as you mentioned, the layers of inequality between Blacks and whites in this country as a result of the segregated communities that we've been forced to live in, it's just so massive. The layers of inequality and disparities, so difficult to undo, so overwhelming. it's a lot easier to believe that, nobody had the government didn't have a big role to play in it, or it was just a few bad apples, or it was just a natural occurrence. It's easier to believe that myth than to really understand the true history, which is that our government took unconstitutional actions to create segregation. And that then leaves us with the obligation to do something about it. It's taken so long for us to confront this because it's more comfortable not to.
The book is really known for seeming to focus on the impact of government intentional action to create segregation in Black and brown communities. But do you think that there aren't similar stories about how this has occurred for Asian communities or Mexican communities or any other sort of, smaller demographic group that has managed to be caught in the web of some of these actions?
Yeah, sure. There are many ways that, Hispanic, Asian communities have been impacted by the same policies that created African American and white segregation, and many ways that they would benefit from the same remedies that would remedy Black-white segregation. But the policies that created the segregation of African Americans were so specifically aimed at African Americans and at suppressing their well-being that if we really want to be specific about our remedies, we have to be specific about who we're talking about and which communities and which policies we're trying to remedy. And because the policies that created the segregation of African Americans were so specific and so unique, and the history and legacy of slavery and Jim Crow is so unique to African Americans, it sort of does a disservice to lump all suppressed, disadvantaged communities together. Remedies need to be specific to the policies that created the disparities. And that's why we focus specifically on the unconstitutional actions that created the segregation of African Americans and what we can do to remedy that now. Because those are different remedies than the remedies for the segregation of Latinos or Asian communities.
So there have been some efforts, legal efforts on the part of government to address some of these outcomes, such as the Fair Housing Act of 1968, the Community Reinvestment Act in the 70s. But yet it doesn't seem as though they have been really that effective in helping to break the hold on these communities. Why do you think that has been the case?
Well, for one, the Fair Housing Act, it could only affect ongoing discrimination. It outlawed the future discrimination in the sale or rental of housing, which is important. It also needs to be enforced. It's not well enforced. There's not a lot of funding to enforce the provisions of that law. So discrimination still occurs in the sale and rental of housing. And so having the law on the books is just one part of the solution. But the other part is that to truly dismantle segregation and remedy all of the policies and the harms that went into creating it and the ongoing impacts of segregation, we need to also look to the past and address the disparities that already exist because of the policies that went into creating segregation. So the Fair Housing Act is only forward-looking. So as an example, Levittown, you may have heard of outside of New York City, is a suburb created with the help of the federal government by William Levitt, 17,000 homes in the 40s. And the federal government required William Levitt to put racially restrictive covenants on the deeds of these homes that said the homes could only be sold to white families or white households. And at the time when those homes were sold, they were affordable to working families of any race. They were about $100,000 in today's money, subsidized by the federal government. Homeowners could get subsidized mortgages if they were white. And African Americans were prohibited from buying those homes. Homes now in Levittown cost $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, unaffordable to working families. So the white families who were able to buy those homes and then accumulate wealth from the equity appreciation in those homes could then pass on that wealth to future generations to buy their own homes. Well, African American families were prohibited from doing that. So they don't have the wealth accumulated over generations to be able to buy homes in Levittown today. So the Fair Housing Act says that now homes in Levittown have to be sold, on a non-discriminatory basis. So that's why now 2% of Levittown is African American, which is more than when it was created. But the surrounding area around Levittown is 13% African American. And that's due in huge part to the wealth disparities that exist because of these past government actions that basically allowed whites to accumulate wealth through home ownership and subsidized them in doing so and prohibited African Americans from doing that. So to truly redress the segregation of Levittown and communities like Levittown all across the country, we have to not only address the future and ongoing ways that African Americans can be discriminated against, but also the disparities that exist from those past actions to truly create equity in those communities.
I think that as we talk to the future leaders of the real estate industry, right, we try to share with them history. We try to share with them the current day view of the outcome of these historical actions. And we try to inspire them to do something different, do something better. I know we're going to talk in a little bit about your new book with your dad, Just Action, which I think will address some of that. But as your dad looked at how law has been put in place and had such an impact, where do we start? Where do we realistically try to get our future leaders to think about how to make sure that we don't double down on history or we don't, recreate history again? Because of course, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. So how do we teach them these lessons so that they can look at their future actions in a better outcome, for a better outcome?
Well, I think we begin by teaching the true history, as you said. Once we stop believing this myth that it was nobody's responsibility, the creation of segregated communities was sort of, just natural or an accident. Once we actually can see the role that the real estate industry played, and I can give a little examples. So as an example, in 1924, the real estate association adopted a code of ethics requiring that its agents, that real estate agents across the country, impose segregation. So use their roles as real estate agents to create segregated communities, to not allow integration to occur. In 1948, when the Supreme Court ruled that racially restrictive covenants were unenforceable, those are the same covenants that were on the homes in places like Levittown, the Supreme Court ruled them unenforceable. And so the Los Angeles Realty Board launched a campaign nationally to create a constitutional amendment to allow for race discrimination in the sale of housing. The California Real Estate Association supported this effort, and it wasn't successful, but these are just a few of the examples of how the real estate industry has long been on the side that played an active role in creating and maintaining segregation. Another example is, real estate boards around the country, they are tasked with licensing real estate agents, so training them and then licensing them. And they can lift licenses when they feel a real estate agent is not performing its duties. And into the 1960s, real estate boards around the country lifted licenses and expelled members who sold homes in white neighborhoods to African American homebuyers. So these are active roles that the real estate industry has played in creating and maintaining segregation. And I think those of us learning about real estate and wanting to go into the field need to know this history and need to know that real estate agents have an obligation to act differently now.
We have actually had a lot of conversation about the role that the real estate, especially the residential real estate industry, has played in the perpetuation of racial separation and segregation. As you know, and your dad writes about so clearly how Chicago was pretty much the birth of redlining, and how many Chicago Association realtors were for the separation of the races and perpetuated that, in addition to just keeping Black realtors from even being a part of the association. Do you want to mention kind of the redlining influence here and how pervasive that was?
Sure, that was very pervasive. Now, that was the government determining which areas of a city were prime areas for giving mortgages. And they rated those areas based on how many non-white people lived in them. So if there were any African Americans in the neighborhood or even near it, it was a less high quality area for giving mortgages. And so you couldn't get mortgages in those areas. And it created not only the separation of people, but the separation of resources. So when one area was able to get mortgages and buy homes and be a neighborhood of homeowners, while the African-American neighborhood in that same city were not allowed access to mortgages and home ownership. And the rent prices would go up, and it led to overcrowded housing by necessity and contract sales, which are, when speculators sort of exploit home buyers, people who think they're home buyers, but end up buying a home on contract, and then they can be, foreclosed on, or not even foreclosed because they never own the home, but they can be kicked out of the home and lose all of the payments they've made for one late payment. So all of these sort of resulted from the segregation and separation of resources and people into separate neighborhoods, which was, an act of government with the support and the active participation of the real estate industry.
And we continue to see the long-term implications of that. And I look forward to having a future discussion with you about where we go from here and how through just action, we can actually make a difference in how the outcomes play out for any of these communities going forward. So Leah, thank you for joining me to talk about Color of Law. I look forward to our future discussion about your upcoming book, Just Action. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.